Okay, I'm going to start adding my binding now. Now I started by making sure that I have a nice straight end on my binding, and I'm going to open my binding up and I'm just going to fold over approximately 1/2 inch. I'm not measuring it, it's just approximate. And I'm just going to finger press that in. In fact, I'm just going to pop a clip on it because it makes it easier. And I'm going to start by starting to fix my binding on the inside top corner. And it can be either side, but on this side, that's difficult to show you because I'm kind of doing it. I can't do it away from myself. But let's start here. And I'm putting my binding, that folded edge, as close as I possibly can to that back gusset and clipping it in place. And I'm just going to continue round. I'm going to try and find an angle where you can see what I'm doing. Continue round, and I know I can't see what I'm doing, so I'm playing this one, winging it a bit. Adding the binding, and this has got the open edge towards the raw edges of the bag, all the way around. And you can see we're actually on the outside of these flaps, not on the inside. So don't be thinking you need to go inside of the flaps, you're going to go outside of the flaps. I may have to put this back on again because I'm probably making a real pig's ear of it, because I am actually not seeing what I'm doing. I'm watching myself in the video, which isn't helpful. Put plenty of clips in to make sure that it's all in place. When you get to the bottom here, you can come along this bottom edge. The straight edges are the easy bits. Again, making sure that the raw edges of your binding match up with the raw edges of your bag. Find more clips. Come around the corner again. I'm going to go all the way back up to that top edge where we started. When I get to the top edge there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave myself approximately 1 inch. So you can see I've got just that little bit of extra. Don't worry too much about that at this point though. Now I'm just going to turn this round so I can actually see what I've done, just to make sure my binding is actually where I need it to be. Well, that wasn't a bad job for somebody that was doing it blind. Sometimes I even surprise myself. You could do with a few extra clips though. Okay, so that's my binding all fitted on that side. Now, what I'm going to do, and you'll have to start at different ends on the other. You'll start at different end on each side, just because it makes it easier to manipulate the bag. On this side, I'm going to have to start at the top end, so this end where I've got this extra piece. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fold that extra piece over, so that I've got that sort of hem like I made in the first, at the other end of my binding. And what I'm going to do is I want it to be approximately 1/8 of an inch taller. Now let me see if I can actually show you that. Just 1/8 of an inch taller than the binding on the gusset. Just you'll see why when we get to the hand sewn bit. I'm just going to do that again because it's not very tidy. It just needs to overlap the top of the bag by a tiny little bit, a tiny fraction. Okay, and just clip it in place once you've got that in. So I'm now going to move the handles out of the way, and I'm going to stitch down my binding using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm starting at the top end on this side. When you do the other side, you'll start at the inside edge where you started, because it's just more intuitive to sew that way. Now, bearing in mind how many layers you're going through at this point, you've got 2 layers of foam, plus the fabric, plus the lining, plus the binding, what have you. You may need to put a slightly larger needle in. My machine does this quite well with a 16, but depending on how thick your fabric is, you may need an 18. So I'm slowly, carefully coming down. And the same thing applies when we get to that bottom corner as applied before, in so much as I'm just going to pull the binding and the base out of the way using that sort of that tuck type, the fin, I think I called it, and it will help to give us nice mitered corners. Now, for a lot of people that are quilters, this is back to front. They'd expect to do the machining on the outside and then hand stitching on the inside. I found that didn't really work very well for this particular design because of the peculiar shape of it. If you're quilting, if you're making a quilt, it's a square usually, or a rectangle, so nice straight edges, easy to do. When you've got something that's a 3D shape and it's not a regular square or cube, then you have to kind of come up with be slightly more inventive sometimes, and this just didn't work the other way. So again, I'm finishing 1/4 of an inch away from that very corner on the bottom, and I'm going to pull that fin over and stitch up the side. And this is where we've got our curve. Now, what I like to use when I'm going around this curve is I like to use an awl just to kind of hold it in place. Sometimes as you're stitching around curves with binding, your binding will stretch slightly. It's to do with the pressure of your the pressure of your presser foot on the fabrics, and the fact that it's quite thick that you're going, the thickness that you're going through. I find if I use an awl and I just hold the binding down just in front of the foot, I don't get that stretching. I can change the pressure on the presser foot on my machine, but I don't like playing with things. If it works already, I don't want to play with it and make it change it, because you never know if it's ever going to work again. Make sure that you keep your handle out of the way. You don't want to stitch over your handle when you're doing this. Gradually coming all the way around that curve. Back to the end. Now, if I show you that on the inside, you can see how that was clipped. There's that folded edge where I'd folded it in a ½ inch, and it's literally butted right up to the back gusset. But it's easier to see once it's stitched in because I can kind of pull it about. So that's one side of your binding attached. Now, if you have any little lumps where your binding was sticking out at the end of your bottom gusset, just trim those off, because you'll get a lump in your binding when you pull it through, when you pull it round, if you've got those. So what we're going to do is we're going to put more threads here, blooming threads, honestly. We're going to pull the binding that we've just put on out from the side that we've just stitched, so that it's now facing the side panel. So you can see it's kind of come round now, and you're going to carefully, very carefully, pull the binding around and over the seam allowance. When I say pull it, I mean gently ease it. Do not pull it and stretch it, because if you do, what you'll end up with is puckered binding, and that just looks unattractive. So just gently ease it over. You're not bending any of that seam allowance as you do it. When you get to this bottom corner, exactly the same way as we did with the front flaps, push your fabric down into the corner and then push the bottom fabric up to create a mitered corner. So a nice 90 degrees. I've got a bit of cotton that's sticking out of there, so that's going to bug me. A nice 90-degree mitered corner. Let me see if I can. I've got my fingernail on it, so you probably can't see it, but it's a mitered corner. You'll notice more once it's been stitched, but it really is important. For me, it's really important that those look nice. I think it's really important, if you're going to use binding, to do it well. So once I've got that mitered corner over, I'm just going to clip it in place. I'm going to ease the rest of the binding round, nice and gently, without pulling it too much. And I'm coming up to the next corner, so I'm going to, all these threads, I'm going to push it into the corner, and again I'm just going to, let me see if I can make that, if I can do that any clearer. I'm not sure if I can. Fold that on over and you get that lovely mitre. And then we're going to go up around this curve, and I'm just literally clipping it in place, and it should, if you've done your binding on the bias, which you should have done, if you followed the instructions, your binding will all be cut on the bias. You should ease, it should ease around this curve without any problem at all, nice and tidily, without any puckers. It's about kind of manipulating but without pulling, and you do have to be very, very careful. So when you get to this top end, you've got that folded edge. Let me just grab another clip. Pop that folded edge in. You'll find that this one, the one at the top of the straight edge, overlaps it slightly, and you find it tips out at the top. Now we are now going to, it's up to you. If you want to machine stitch that binding in place, then please do. It's not easy to do because you are going around a 3D shape, and you need to stitch ideally as close as you can to the folded edge of the binding. If you plan on doing it by hand, then grab a cup of coffee, get yourself something on Netflix, because it will take a little while, and it's a bit like most things, it's just better if it's done slowly and by hand. So I'm going to start just by burying my knot on the end within the seam allowance, within the and I'm going to start by going down this long straight edge in exactly the same way as I have done with all of the other hand sewing, just doing a nice tiny whip stitch. When I say tiny, the stitches are probably 3/16 of an inch apart, something like that. Less than 1/4 of an inch, that's for sure. I've got my threads a bit long here, and I'm picking up all sorts of stray bits as I go, so I need to just, I'm doing this at a very strange angle so you can see it, and it's not helping. So you're just going to carry on. I'm just going to take that clip off though, because that is bugging me and it keeps catching my thread. You're just going to, now I've got my scissors. I'm just going to carry on all the way around the outside, catching those mitered corners when you get to the mitered corners so that they stay nicely mitered, and keeping your stitching small and even. It won't be entirely invisible. If you do a ladder stitch, it's less visible. I just find I can't do ladder stitch for very long. It makes my eyes go funny, so this is my preferred stitch. I'm using a self-coloured thread, so you won't actually see the stitching at all once it's done, in the grand scheme of things. So what we do basically is this all the way around, and we're going to do exactly the same thing on the other side, so that you'll have two sides of your bag completely bound. So I'm not going to have you sit and watch me do this. I'm going to carry on and do my stitching this side and then put my binding on the other side, and I will come back and we'll talk about snaps on the pockets, snaps on the front flaps, and the firm base.